All right, all right. Welcome to the Ujamaa Hour. Welcome to the Ujamaa Hour. I am Michael Tekin Strode, and we are opening up the floor. Give me just a moment. I just want to make sure that we adjust this timer because while this episode may go slightly long, I also, want to make sure that I'm keeping myself aware of where we are in time. So this is the Ujamaa Hour. We are into this second season. I want to go ahead and do a recap of the first season. But first, I want to invite you to go ahead and loop your friends in. If you have not shared the feed, please make sure that you go ahead and share this feed out to your groups, to your pages, to your friends. Invite folks in. I just want to note that earlier today, as I was circulating this scheduled event, I did get a notification from Facebook that apparently I was placing this in places where people might not be interested. I disagree, right? Because I know all of these spaces where I was circulating, the solidarity economy groups, the Black permaculture groups. These are folks that I'm already personally looped in with, so it's interesting for Facebook to tell me who my friends are and tell me what my friends are about. So if you have not shared the feed, please make sure that you go ahead and tell somebody, invite somebody, bring somebody in, because there's some dynamic and dynamite information that's going to be shared here tonight. Before we go forward, where is my logo? It is not there. Let me fix that, if I can. I'm sure I can. Yes, while I'm setting that, this presentation is being brought to you by BEBA, that is the Bridge Embassy for Black America. The Bridge Embassy for Black America is a space where we build and protect Black. Build and protect Black what? Black culture, Black sanity, Black wealth, Black futures. We build and protect it all. Effectively, this is a space where we are thinking consciously, thinking intentionally about where we are spending our dollar, where we are circulating our dollar. We are thinking intentionally about where we are spending and circulating our time. We are thinking intentionally about how we are reinvesting in our communities. And the Bridge Embassy for Black America is a space where we engage in that type of conscious practice, that type of awareness. And I want to make sure that my overlay, boom, is there. Yes, so we fixed it. There's our overlay. In the bottom right corner, you see that Bridge Embassy logo. Of course, at the top, you have that Aya fern. At the bottom, I want to say that that's an Akan golden stool. That shows that I don't know my logo, right? So I'll have to go ahead and make sure that I hip you all to that later. But in the meantime, in between time, we are 3 minutes into the segment, and I want to start off with a bit of discussion, a bit of engagement around this segment, around why I launched this segment. So a couple of things, So again, we're into the second season, and I just want to go back and really think about the origin of this segment. So the segment was BEBA inspired, certainly. So inside of BEBA, one of the things that we are doing is we are circulating receipts. We are thinking about cooperative economics from a consumption perspective, from a perspective of where we spend. We are also thinking about where we are spending time and where we are investing time. There's an element of cooperative economics that is sometimes undercovered, right? And it's this notion of cooperative economics that speaks to the cooperative strategies, that are worker cooperatives, housing cooperatives, consumer cooperatives, because what we are trying to do is not necessarily build individual wealth, but what we are trying to do is we're trying to build social and communal wealth. And the critical thing about that is that it's not necessarily the individual wealth that saves us, right? It's that communal wealth that actually saves us, that actually ensures that when there is a tragedy, when there is something that is a tremendous devastation to sort of the communal space, it's that communal wealth, that communal integrity that is actually going to hold us together, hold that community together. And we can see that very clearly with the fact that the 2008 financial crisis essentially wiped out, what, two or three generations of wealth, of accumulated wealth, wealth that we had worked for decades, right? That we had worked against the tide, right, against the current, to accumulate for decades. It was individual wealth that was individually held within individual families, and when, possibly, it's either a single dad decision, it's either a specific, a specifically targeted exploitation of those families, right? Any element like that sweeps away, that really targets the individual wealth building capacity of a family, of individual families and communities, can wipe out that individual wealth. But effectively, when individual wealth is impacted inside of those communities, we know that depending upon how the fabric of the community, the wealth of the community, that's how well the schools are built, or how well the schools are resourced and funded. That's what type of commercial institutions or commercial what is the sort of commercial sector happening inside of that community? How active is that space? And then that's what sort of accumulated wealth that family might have to rely upon if they lose something like a home. Do they have other wealth bulwark that they can fall back on, whether that's with other family members, or whether that's just other elements of the community that they can depend upon when they fall on hard times. The unfortunate thing is that in many of our communities, we don't have that sort of framework. We don't have that sort of communal wealth infrastructure that we can fall back on when times become difficult, and so we are really forced to rely upon programs from above, and that's it's a very legitimate thing. We should pursue the governmental programs that are meant to serve as sort of the social contract and the social infrastructure for us. But ultimately, sometimes those programs fail too. And when we don't have the sort of communal wealth infrastructure, and when we don't have a sort of governmental infrastructure that's fully dependable, then ultimately we are left to the whims of the times, So we are left to that financial crisis, and we are left to that single climactic event that wipes away generations of wealth. And so, yes, so this segment, the Ujamaa Hour, is really about us thinking about the broader cooperative economic strategies that really go beyond us supporting individual businesses and supporting sort of individual wealth building initiatives, but really thinking about how do these elements tie together inside of a social ownership structure, and that's the social ownership of housing, collective housing, cooperative housing, the social ownership of businesses, collaborative and cooperative businesses that exist inside of community spaces, and certainly, one of the spaces that I come from is the social ownership of food delivery systems. So one of the things that we really targeted inside of the Healthy Food Hub was recognizing that the point of decision-making inside of the food system does not happen at the point of purchase, right? So you can choose what you purchase when you go into a store, but if you are not at the sort of decision-making body that is the in-between between where food is produced and where food is distributed, there's that aggregation point. If you do not have the control of that aggregation point, then you are not ultimately deciding what type of food exists in your community. So if we wanted to actually, in the Healthy Food Hub model, if we wanted to democratize the food system, as it were, right, if we wanted to really give people control over the types of foods that were available in their community and the types of food that they were able to consume, then we actually had to go back and look at, as we would say in the Healthy Food Hub, owning the pipeline. And so owning the pipeline means looking at what hands touch the production line, the production of food, what hands touch the aggregation of food, and then how is food distributed, and how does the community actually have a say over each part of that value chain, that's the value chain, that supply chain. So inside of the Healthy Food Hub, we wanted to make sure that we knew who was at each point inside of that value chain, who was at production, who was at aggregation, and who was at distribution. And that was the only way that you could actually ensure that the community had a democratic sort of vote in how food was delivered, and and how that food was delivered in its community and packaged. So that's some of how this show comes to be, right? Another part of how this show comes to be is the work of the Coconut Collaborative, which grows out of the Healthy Food Hub and the Black Oak Center. And it grows out of a narrative that in Black Oaks, when they held their permaculture course, now permaculture is this notion of sustainable agriculture. It's an agriculture that is in line with nature. So you're trying to figure out how to mimic nature in the ways that you produce food. And so inside of that agricultural model, you're thinking about where water would flow naturally, and you're trying to ensure that you plant where water flows naturally, where water aggregates naturally. You're trying to build up systems that are self-perpetuating, right? So that you don't have to go each year and try to cultivate a plot of land, but that land will sort of naturally cultivate elements of itself or reproduce elements of itself each year. And so one of the things that Black Oaks focused on in their permaculture course was this idea of social permaculture. And this idea of social permaculture, from their perspective, was that you can't establish community resilience by doing permaculture with a lens towards just getting a group of people to grow food, right? Before you can get a group of people together to grow food, you actually have to deal with the relational dynamics that exist between people. And you have to figure out what draws people together, what keeps people together. That's that element of community resilience that precedes being able to have food resiliency, have a resilient food system, right? And so Black Oaks in their permaculture program really focused on that social permaculture aspect, and that allowed me to really, explore the development of the Coconut Collaborative, which is a time bank that is focused on helping communities to map out their skills, map out their assets, and to really figure out how to deploy assets in their community so that you can find the best use for those assets. You can use those assets. Again, we talk about in Bridge those 8 forms of capital, that social, that intellectual, that political, that human. Those 8 forms of capital, really thinking about how you can deploy that human capital that exists in your community and ensure that it is there to help to build up that community wealth, to restore or to refine that community wealth. So one of the things that we're doing here in my neighborhood in Chicago, I'm in southeast Chicago in a neighborhood called South Deering. For those who are from Chicago, it's a part of the South that, folks just don't visit. But effectively, one of the things that we're doing inside of South Deering is we're thinking through a strategy for a collaboratively owned store model. So we have lots of vacant storefronts, and you've heard me talk about this before. It's an ongoing project. It's an ongoing initiative. But effectively, we've got these vacant storefronts. We've got this vacant commercial space here, and we're trying to think about how to activate commercial space from a collaboratively owned perspective. And one of the things that we're certainly looking at, that I've sent around to members of the Neighborhood Association is the model of the Ujamaa Collective, Lakeisha Wolf there in Pittsburgh, in the Hill District, looking at how you get, how you aggregate the artisans and the creators in a community into a space, not unlike here in Chicago, the Black Mall, which is an aggregation of Black creatives, of Black artisans, of Black businesses in one space, effectively trying to build a cooperatively owned corner store. So they're still working out some of the elements of their cooperative model. So that's something that certainly we're thinking about here in South Deering, because ultimately, you've also heard me talk about, the reliance upon anchor commercial institutions or anchor commercial sectors. So we lost, on the South Side, the Target and the Marshalls and the Dominick's, and it was this over-reliance on an anchor strategy, on an anchor retail strategy, on an anchor retail model that allowed communities to become dependent upon these particular actors, and then from that space really have to be at a loss, be sort of at the back foot, be caught on the back foot when these retail partners decided to vacate their communities, right? So those are some elements of why this particular show was launched. This production focus, cooperative economic strategies, it's also a missing narrative, right? I'm a great consumer of podcasts. I consume things like the Next System, like Next Economy Now, Lit Review, Everything Co-op, Millennials Are Killing Capitalism, How to Survive the End of the World, The Wonderful Brown Sisters, Black Agenda Report, Who Makes Sense. In all of these spaces, I was looking for a narrative about black economy, about black communal economies and local economies that are being developed inside of black communities, and how those things are being formed, how those relationships are being maintained, how those relationships are challenged. And I could not locate that narrative in any of my listening, right? I'm a deep researcher in the Malcolm tradition, right? And I'm trying to locate that, and I'm following my curiosity to find that. And I've assembled a set of conversations for the remainder of this year that are helping me to investigate that in the public space before you, so we can investigate those things together. And that's what I hope to do this evening, and that's what I hope to do throughout 2019, and we'll see what happens for 2020. Perhaps we'll be back with that third season, and I hope to see you there. So before we begin, I want to go ahead and if you're in the comment section, I know that this is going to be, we've got two very power-packed individuals, just dynamic, wonderful individuals that are going to be part of this conversation this evening. So as you come up with questions, please make sure you go ahead and drop them in the comment section. I want to make sure that, we don't get that lag that happens when, I call for questions, and essentially, we have to kind of wait for the camera time to catch up with Facebook. And so as you come up with questions, make sure you go ahead and post them in the comment section. We will go ahead and make sure that we ask them, as we enter that section. But now I want to go ahead and bring in our guest for this evening, Danielle Mkali of Nexus Community Partners and Malaya Connelly of Village Financial Cooperative, both out of the Twin Cities. Nexus Community Partners is really focused on developing those communal wealth strategies, and Danielle Mkali is the Director of Community Wealth Building, and also, the steward of a wonderful program that I was very inspired to learn about when I did, which was the North Star Black Cooperative Fellowship, and we'll get some further details about that. Malaya Connelly is the Director of Development, and I realize and I'll fix that later. Malaya Connelly, Director of Development of the Village Financial Cooperative, a community development financial institution based in North Minneapolis, which is really focused on delivering on the challenge to address the racial and economic justice agenda of black communities there in Minneapolis. And so we're going to get some insight about those projects this evening. So I want to go ahead and bring in my guests for this evening, Danielle Mkali and Malaya Connelly. All right, and you are on the segment. Welcome to the Ujamaa Hour.
Thank you. So good to be here.
Thanks for having us.
Excellent. Yes. Wonderful having you here this evening. So why don't we open up with just, so perhaps, Danielle, if you can go ahead and maybe just give us an introduction and some background on your work and maybe how you arrived at this space of being Director of Community Wealth Building at Nexus.
Yeah, sure. I think it's been a long time coming in terms of when I look back on, where I've been and where I've come from. I've worked at a lot of cooperatives, lived in a cooperative, did some community organizing for many years, and then joined Nexus Community Partners in 2013. And at that time, a lot of the focus of their work was a lot on asset and wealth building. Kind of traditional asset and wealth building, looking at supporting individual home buyer education classes, entrepreneurship classes, and supporting different, Black, Indigenous, people of color-led organizations that were providing education in those areas. And then also making investment in actual buildings, bricks and mortar buildings that would support Black, Indigenous, people of color, BIPOC groups in opening businesses in a lot of those places. And as we were going through that process, and we still support a lot of that work in that area, but we also realized that it wasn't really hitting the root cause. It wasn't really radical enough, and started shifting our focus onto community wealth building and wanting to learn more about what that would mean for us as an organization. As a part of that, started to learn more about cooperative work. And right around that time was when Dr. Jessica Gordon-Nemhard came out with her book, Collective Courage, The History of African American Cooperative Economic Thought and Practice. And I worked with some other folks. Our organization worked and partnered with some other folks in the Twin Cities to help bring Dr. Nemhard to the Twin Cities to share that history. And while I always thought cooperatives were a great way of building power, sharing wealth, democratic ownership, I didn't quite understand fundamentally what they meant to me as a Black woman, and the history and legacy of cooperative economics in the United States for Black people. Dr. Nemhard discusses her work as like a continuation of Du Bois's work, and Du Bois, kind of begins his discussion of cooperative economics as that of the Underground Railroad. And so in his paper that he put out on economic cooperation among Negroes in, 1911 or something like that, talks about, Harriet Tubman being one of the most important people in the economic cooperative movement. And she also illuminated something very important to us about the lynching movement in this country, and that the majority of the lynchings that have happened in the United States were in a targeted terrorist attack against Black people that had acquired social and economic and political power. If you look back at Mississippi in the mid 1800s, we had more Black registered voters than white voters in Mississippi. And Dr. Nemhard talks about that a lot of the power that we got was through cooperative efforts and through economic cooperation. And we were just really blown away by this information. I think when we brought her to community, and community also was learning about this, we all kind of felt like no one had shared this information with us. And it was one of those things where we all knew that there was a big reason why it hadn't been shared with us. So not only were these things about the lynching movement, but there was also things in her book about, formerly enslaved Africans holding millions of dollars together collectively in mutual aid societies in the mid 1800s. And that blew me away. How would you organize an association in 1860 with 200,000 members and collectively move millions of dollars together? And so those types of things really impacted how I was thinking about wealth building, how our organization was thinking about wealth building. And so we began on this journey of really thinking about how we would create a space for Black folks to come together to learn and study about Black economic cooperation. So fast forward to 2017, and we launched the North Star Black Cooperative Fellowship, which is a fellowship designed and dedicated for Black folks that are interested in developing either deeper thought or a Black cooperative initiative on their own, or maybe they're already a part of a Black cooperative initiative. And the cooperatives are as diverse as the Black folks that are a part of them. So everything from housing, worker-owned cooperatives to the Financial Cooperative that Malia is leading. And we've had 3 cohorts since then. I'm 2/3 of the way through with our 3rd cohort right now. So we've had about 20 people come through, and there's another 15 in this cohort now. And Nexus also works to support folks that are looking to convert a business into a worker-owned cooperative. So part of the work that we're doing is elevating this idea that if you're wanting to retire, and you'd like to see your legacy of your business live on with the values that you put into that business for years and years, maybe consider selling that business to the workers. And that can be a really great way to transfer a great deal of wealth, and also for that family to get paid, and also to see their values live on through the workers that they've become a part of their successful business for years. And then we also work to support other Black and Indigenous and people of color that are looking to help support other people of color in starting their own cooperatives. So in Minnesota, another reason why we felt it was really significant to create a space for Black folks is that Minnesota has more cooperatives per capita than any other state. It's a significant part of our economy. It employs a lot of people in really great jobs. And yet there's, I think, 2 Black-led cooperatives at this point in time in our state. And I think nearly 2,000 cooperatives in the state. So we want to be able to support Black folks and have other Black folks that they can go and learn from about how to start their cooperatives, or who they can get loans from, and financial support to start their cooperatives as well. I think importantly with I can leave it there, and then maybe Malia can go on.
Well, yes. So we definitely want to leave space because I don't know if I encountered Blexit before I met Danielle, and certainly that's Blexit, Minnesota, Salon. But I don't know if I encountered that page before I met Danielle or afterwards. But I definitely was impressed, in the reading of the hotboxing document, right? And thinking about gentrification as a specific and targeted strategy of displacement. So perhaps why don't you go ahead and maybe introduce your work and your background, but also speak to how your work is addressing some of those elements of gentrification, and certainly with the New Day loan, addressing the sort of economic exploitation of these communities.
That's a lot. Okay.
I don't know how you're going to fit it in there. We'll work it out.
Have to be like Danielle and get it all in. So I think since you mentioned Blexit, I can start there. My work my vocation, I think, in Black liberation began in 2014 when I attended my first protest and I left my job and management. My profession was more in operations and internal infrastructure for small businesses. And I decided to shift that and focus that skill towards Black-led organizations and towards the Black liberation. So in that, I transitioned and became the first. Hold on, my dog is whining. He needs to go outside.
Okay. Keep telling my story. Where did she leave us?
She was talking about transitioning from the operations to leading Black-led organizations, and I think there was
Great. I'm back. Thanks, y'all. So. In that transition, I started working as an operations director for, I believe, one of the only Black-led movement organizations in the state, Minnesota Neighborhoods Organizing for Change. And in that, during my tenure there, if I could call it that, we witnessed 2 of the most devastating losses in our community, and that was Jamar Clark and Philando Castile. And the organization that I worked for was very much focused on traditional organizing work through direct action and through legislative change. And for me, I felt as though that was really putting a lot of pressure on young Black, brilliant leaders in our community who shut down freeways and who led direct actions, but were also heavily traumatized during the 4th Precinct occupation after Jamar Clark was taken from us, and also the occupation of the governor's residence after Philando Castile was taken from us by the hands of police. And so seeing that pattern over and over again, really, I think it was concerning the entire community about the exhaustion that caused to our community activists. And always putting Black youth at the front lines of the movement was not sustainable, and it wasn't healthy. And so the concept of Blexit was around how do we leverage activist-minded folks in our community that might not feel comfortable shutting down freeways, but we're down to shift their money and participate economically in ways that could be just as powerful. So economic resistance was really something that coined our work, and exiting systems that benefit from our pain was kind of the center of the manifesto that we sent out for our first meeting, which was a week after Philando was taken from us. And when we had that meeting, almost 200 community members came out on the north side of Minneapolis and decided through small group sessions and several rounds of voting, the number one idea in that room that night that had over double the votes of anything else was to establish a Black-led financial institution on the north side. And so as we went down that road of campaigning towards this idea and bringing people around this concept, we were challenged with the decision of whether this is a Black bank or some other institution. And I think this is kind of where Danielle and I's work started to collide, was that when we really reflected on the capitalistic system, we knew that another Black bank would not get to the core of the issues that we were facing as a community, because it would replicate the same capitalistic ideals that we were fighting against. And so we started to really look at the cooperative model as an alternative to the traditional banking financial system. And that's really when we made that decision and pivoted towards the cooperative as a viable institution for this work. And as we centered around that, around February of 2017, we launched our work under the umbrella of the Association for Black Economic Power. And in that, we decided not only were we going to work towards establishing a Black-led credit union, but we also decided that we wanted to ignite a broader Black cooperative ecosystem on the north side. And through that, the idea was that the cooperative entity is more resilient for the Black community as far as a business entity than a corporation or a partnership or a sole proprietorship, because it helps us to leverage our collective wealth, and it helps us to protect ourselves when it comes to risk. And so we don't have the same safety nets that our white and otherwise counterparts have in business, like you mentioned earlier in your introduction. And so because of that, how can we insulate our wealth and leverage all of the assets that we have? And so we're really proud that, you know, a community that folks thought didn't have any money, that no banks would be willing to open branches in, that is heavily, you know, sourced by predatory financial institutions, came out, and the majority of the pledged deposits that we received in the last 2 years are from Black folks on the north side, who everyone counted as, you know, and dismissed, counted out and dismissed. And we now look at a collective deposit of $4.25 million with just 1,600 pledged members. And so it really speaks to the fact that there is wealth and there's prosperity in our community. What we need is infrastructure to insulate that wealth, to protect it in the right methods to make sure to circulate that in proper ways. So that really has been our work. And you mentioned the New Day loan. In our, you know, in the middle of us doing our pledge campaign, the number one question that we get from everyone is, you know, when are you going to be open so I can move my money? And one night we had a text message from a pledged member who was in line at Walmart waiting to cash checks and other people waiting to get payday loans. And they were asking, well, when are you going to be open so I don't have to do this anymore? And our response was, we don't need a credit union actually to solve that problem. And so we launched the New Day loan last summer as a beta to see what would happen if we created a consumer loan that was up to $500, 0 to 8% interest, up to 6 month term, and provided that to our direct community. And it was a huge success. And so by November, we had almost 20 loans out the door at 100% repayment rate. So it really showed that there was a hunger for this kind of product, and that there was definitely resiliency in presenting that product in a cooperative way, that people were eager to return money to make sure that it was available for their neighbor or the other person in their community. And so we're looking at the data now. We've just wrapped up that beta, and we're looking to relaunch that product once the credit union is open. And as I mentioned, we've raised $4.2 million of pledged deposits. We've raised over $1 million of operating capital. And we're marching very, very steadfastly towards a Juneteenth opening all depending on what the National Credit Union Administration decides on approving our insurance and whether or not they do that on time. So this was a very, very quick process. A typical credit union startup takes 3 to 5 years. And so we were able to do what we said we were going to do for our community, follow through on our commitments. When folks said the solution to, economic inequity and the oppression that we face as a people, if you think about Black folks in a room who are all mourning after the second Black man in our community in less than a year was taken by police, the clarity of mind for them to say, we need a financial institution in our community led by us is absolutely incredible. And so for us to have that mandate and hold it has been an honor. It's definitely been unprecedented, and we're excited for the results, hopefully soon.
Excellent. So when I do the sort of when I talk about sort of the historical timeline of my launching or establishing, moving forward with this idea of the Cola-Nut Collaborative as a time bank that could service, initially sort of South Chicago and then sort of then a larger sort of body of Chicago. It's not very long from the beginning of this timeline where I'm saying, okay, I think I should work on a time bank, to where I get to this idea where I'm like, oh, wait, but a time bank doesn't make sense without this sort of larger ecosystem of solidarity economy initiatives. Tell me about what sort of the timeline looks for you all when you begin to think about this cooperative economic strategy, to when you start to think about other elements that might need to be in place to make these things sustainable and make these things possible.
I mean, in part, one of the things that we thought about was the gathering that we hosted last fall, Blackonomics, where you were able to come from Chicago to the Twin Cities to spend some time with us. And, I think what we've thought is similar to you is building connections in our own local community, really starting to feel out like what it means to really cooperate together. I think one of the things that I've discovered on this journey of creating the space of the North Star is that one of the largest challenges is figuring out how to trust yourself enough to know who to trust your cooperative work with. And so I know that this work has to be very hyper-local and that it's very relational, but I also think that there is so much value in building connections and networks with like-minded people that are doing that really deep, relational, local work across communities. And we also felt that it was important to figure out a way to share some space with other Black Midwesterners that were thinking about solidarity economy and cooperative economic work, and that there were lessons that we all could probably share with each other that would help us to do our work better together. I've been working on being able to share tools that we use in North Star in terms of how you create cooperatives. I think we were in that session together when we were looking at what is the proper development timeline for a cooperative initiative. And the answer really is, at the end of the day, it just depends on what your cooperative is, and it might be very cyclical anyways. But just different tools that would be useful across the board. And I think also from your work that you've been doing, and that Malia, that we've all been doing here, I can't stress enough the value of having a Black space for people to do this type of study and development together in. I knew it would be important. I didn't really realize how important it would be until we were all in the room together. So having a space to debate, disagree, learn, appreciate, connect over this legacy and over how we want to build it into the present has been very, very powerful. And so those are things that I think are useful to be thinking about in terms of sharing the work. The other thing, and Malia talked about this in terms of a goal of Blackzit, and it was also a goal of North Star, was to reclaim that this work is ours. I hear, I think, very well-intentioned people talk about our communities in, what do they call it? Not in scarcity ways, right? Where we don't know how to run a business. That's what I hear a lot. Like, we don't know what to do with our money. And I think what Malia is saying is that, no, we do. We just need infrastructure. We need places to do these things. And it's also part of our history that when we have created really successful large institutions, when we've been able to successfully move money through politics, and I'm not talking about recent history. I'm talking, well, not super recent, but like 200 years ago, right, that we became targets. And so I think that it's unfair to say to our communities that we don't know how to do all of these things or that we haven't done these things. No, we're trying to survive. And when we have shown before, rightly, which we have throughout all of our history here, then we've become a bigger target. And so that's part of what I wrestle with every day is how do we do this work? And then also, like, how do we become more resilient as a community so that we're not such an easy target? I don't have the answer. I know organizing is a big piece of this, but...
Yeah, I think organizing, education with, I was a part of the first cohort for North Star Black Cooperative Fellowship, and Danielle is on our board and on our executive committee. And so that cross-pollination is really important. It's very similar to, when you have a barren piece of land that all of a sudden, as these seeds blow in and take root, there has to be cooperation in that ecosystem initially. And having all of that happen in one space actually makes everyone's roots stronger. And so it's a part of respecting and identifying the work that's happening in your backyard and finding meaningful ways to partner and collaborate, staying in your lane and not believing that your thing is the only thing or your way is the only way. A lot of this is building new culture between us, and that goes to, Blackonomics and these other areas is making this cultural and not just, we're not creating it, it's more of a renaissance is what we call it. It's reclaiming that space. But it's also, along with the education and the culture, we have to make sure that we help folks understand the context and not necessarily doing that always out of fear. We talk a lot about Black folks and our net wealth and by 2050 is going to be zero and things like that. We don't need that level of anxiety. We don't need the fear to be fueling this work. The context should be more around the implications that are happening in our world right now, the opportunities for innovation, and the fact that the future, no one knows who it belongs to at this point. I mean, it's basically up in the air. We have the largest generation that our country has ever known about to retire. We have, technology that's on the brink of changing our everyday lives, and there really isn't a front runner on who is going to shape the future of our world. And I really believe that the resiliency of Blackness has proven itself time and time again in this country. And so I want us to approach this with the context of this being an opportunity for us to be leaders in the world in the same way that we have been leaders in cultural spaces, the same way we have shown the world how to reclaim a culture that's been stolen, and how to organically allow an identity to emerge without knowing who your tribe is or knowing your country or knowing your language, knowing that intrinsically about yourself is enough. So having that context for folks and shaping that context is just as important as shaping the narrative. So we have to make sure the way we present, the opportunity to build cooperatively in the proper way and not necessarily out of fear or white-splaining or look at how white people have built this way. It's actually about we have the opportunity to do something we already know how to do and take leadership and take the mantle in like the next stage of human evolution. I don't want to get too Afro-punk sciencey, but
do it.
Excited about this movement. And I believe that we have that essence within our community to take leadership and to be innovators and inventors. So I don't believe this only is coming from the pain of Black oppression, but I believe it's coming from the brilliance of our ancestry and our identity.
Absolutely. And to the point about our economies being connected to our resistance. Oh, there's a little bit of freezing here. I want to make sure. Yeah, to the point of this sort of this economic legacy being connected to resistance. Certainly, we have the history of Ida B. Wells being run out of Memphis, after the lynching of the owners of People's Grocery, right? So I mean, yes, we are standing up and building our own economies in self-sustaining spaces, and then essentially someone feeling threatened by that then pushes back. And then so we are steady resistance. So there's resistance on one hand, and there's this building of new economies on the other. So we definitely have that in our history. And one of the things that we talked about in December with Dr. Kamal Rashid, we did a special edition of the Ujamaa Hour on the Kwanzaa Day of Ujamaa. And so we had an opportunity to investigate the sort of concept around Julius Nyerere's Tanzanian Ujamaa villages. And one of the things that Dr. Rashid talked about was that, when we came over on those boats, it wasn't like we came through some sort of, steam that kind of washed these principles off of us, right? We built quilombos, right? We built maroon towns. We built these spaces that then had very similar economic principles to what we are seeing emerge in these cooperative spaces now. So effectively, yes, we do know how to do this, and we do know that it is embedded in our space, and we do know we can. I always go back to an episode of How to Survive the End of the World, where Adrienne Marie Brown was talking to Alexis Pauling-Gums, who was mentioning the sort of continuity of past, present, and future, right? And how she was looking back at an ancestor who was running forward towards her, but then there's a future ancestor that's looking back and drawing upon her, right? So this continuity, right? We are always sort of in time, building futures, creating past, and walking presence, right? So yes, I really appreciate all of that in this space. So where we'll go now, you've touched upon that sort of that net 2050 anxiety, but Ed Whitfield, he wrote an article called "Unliberated Zones." And effectively, it was him telling us to sort of think through, or him asking us, right? Him asking us to think through this idea of liberated zones. So, and we did an episode, the final episode of the Ujamaa Hour for the first season was about these autonomous spaces. So maybe you could just kind of imagine for me or kind of share with us what your idea of sort of liberated zones and autonomous spaces look like for our communities. I know that's a massive question, right? I'm sorry. I like to ask these massive questions. Just journey with me for a moment, because this is the last question before we open up the floor for other folks to ask less pressing questions.
So I'll go first. Danielle's honing her brilliant response.
Yes.
I think at the core for Blexit, this is going to sound really interesting and kind of an oxymoron, but it is the eradication of the monetary economy. And we don't believe that the monetary economy can exist without capitalism, because it's built upon the concept of scarcity, right? We have this amount of currency that reflects the amount of resources that everyone needs, and that actually doesn't equate, right? We know now, because of science and technology, what resources we have on this planet. And so if we know how to manage them and we understand them enough, we can build economies based on our resources and collectively managing and distributing those resources in equitable ways. So I'm definitely a fan of Zeitgeist, a fan of the Venus Project, and Blexit, even though our method is reclaiming agency in financial institutions, we believe that the cooperative financial institution is a means and a bridge to the way of a resource-based economy and share economies. And we believe we've already done that, and that's not difficult to do. But releasing ourselves from the binds and from the chains of capitalism allows us to focus on self-actualization of humanity and focusing on exploring our world and exploring our universe. Eradicating diseases, it helps us to focus on results of our intelligence and the gift that we've been given in this planet, and protecting it, not necessarily trying to just survive in order to get enough resources to survive, and that cycle continuing. So for us, we believe that the DNA of that type of community actually belongs in the Black community, because we've done it. we have had resource-based economies because we were pushed out of the economic system for so long. And anytime we build economic infrastructures, we had to learn what to do when they were intentionally destroyed. And so if any community on the planet could figure out in this day and age how to use cooperative economics as a bridge toward a resource-based economy, I personally believe that the Black community here in the United States can.
Oh, there we have it.
There it is.
As I was listening to Malia talk, I was like, yeah, sounds incredible. And then I was also just thinking about, I think back to when I was talking about earlier about like trusting ourselves to know who to trust with our work or with our resources. And I was kind of imagining how conflict would look different or how it would have to look different in a space like that, and how as a community we would understand in much more in a deeper way of how we would get to peace more easily together, and working through different conflicts, whether that be in our small families or in neighborhoods. I think that there would be spaces where the young people would feel a sense of hopefulness in all of their homes and in their families, where they would understand that their community had enough for them, and that they could go off and explore and travel, and they should, but that there's abundance in their own community and in their own ways of being with one another. And so I would see that the way that we would handle time would be much, much different. And that we would have the space and time and energy to really feel grounded enough to love each other and to be able to work through conflict and resolution in a much different way. But basically, yes, to what Malia said, but that there is a dynamic of how we relate to one another that would be so profoundly different in what she has laid out, that I think for those of us that have any opportunity to try and figure some of those things out more deeply, it's really powerful today too.
Yes, and you all both aligned with certainly. I was responding to a thread earlier where Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was speaking at South by Southwest and was saying that we fear automation, but perhaps we shouldn't fear automation because of what it might enable. So I kind of responded with a bit of a nuanced response, right? We fear automation because sort of the history of technology doesn't really show that we can equitably then distribute the productivity gains that come from technology. And then I responded also with a link to Ed Whitfield's article on universal basic income, where he kind of critiqued it pretty harshly, right? As it not being the answer. But what he stated was he's like, I don't want the butter, I want the cow. But effectively, after that, at the end of that article, he talks about, and I'll go directly to his notion. So what I do think we need is reparations, the democratization of wealth, the recreation of the commons, and the outlawing of financial systems of theft and speculation. Communities must become their own developers through broadly democratic planning and democratic access to non-extractive financing. So, I see all of those strains in the work of Nexus, of Village Financial, and I really, really appreciate everything that I'm seeing there and everything that we are imagining here in this space. So I want to go ahead and shout out to the floor for questions. If there are questions from folks that you would like to throw at our guests this evening before they depart, please do throw them in the comment section. I'm going to go ahead and make sure that I can see your comments. So please make sure that you post in the comment section any questions that you have for our guest this evening, Danielle Mkali of Nexus Community Partners, Malia Connelly of Village Financial Cooperative, and they are imagining community wealth, liberated zones, non-extractive financial institutions, community-owned, and really thinking through some things that we all need to be embracing this evening. And fortunately, it looks like the dog, has joined us in this conversation. Hi, dog. So, comment section is open. I'm still refreshing to figure out if anyone has posted a question there.
We thought Doc had joined from Facebook, but
right. Pluto. Yeah, Pluto. Yeah, hi Pluto. Just relaxing back there. Hopefully, yes, you'll give us some ideas about what liberated zones look like from a dog's perspective. Let me just post a comment here to let folks know that questions are on the floor.
Yeah, I had seen that quote from AOC earlier and loved it, and it made me think about I've had my kids in this African science program for all their young lives. Every Saturday they go and study African approaches to science, and one of the foundational things is that we're curious and we produce knowledge and science to make our communities better. And so that it's not just out of curiosity to see what we can blow up, destroy, how big. It's to cure disease, figure out how to grow plants differently, how to grow plants that'll solve for pollution or chemical spills. Is always to improve each other. And so again, to that point of just that we've been doing this for a long time.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes, and certainly, I have 20 years in IT consulting, and the best problems that I've ever solved have had nothing to do with computers. So that's the work for me. This systems thinking, this strategy work that I did with Healthy Food Hub and Black Oak Center, and this work that I get to do now with just kind of thinking through these economic ecosystems. All right. Rather quiet in terms of the question section. So why don't you all, in the interim, just tell us about what does the present look like? What does your work look like going forward in the near future here?
This is juicy.
I mean, I kind of shared just working on the credit union. We're towards the tail end of this journey of it opening. Our last leg of this race is getting all of our pledge deposits insured by the National Credit Union Administration, which is the credit union's version of the FDIC. And we're halfway through that process now. So it's, with the government shutdown, then with the current administration, with federal government, you just can't really know. You never really know what the timeline is going to be. So we're just hoping that it falls in our favor. We're interested definitely in technology. We've been working really hard around how do we put our pledge members the forefront of where the financial technology is headed, so that our community isn't put in another position of being preyed upon, but is leading in those areas. And so we're finalizing an agreement with a pretty substantial fintech company where we would be their kind of premier CDFI partner in our region. So we're really excited to announce that soon. Just all great things. Everything is coming to a head.
Yeah. There's so much going on with them. There's a million things up in the air. But I think this is 2 years since we had our first cohort. And so this year we're looking at having a few different cooperatives hopefully get their larger financing, moving ahead, getting, physical sites and locations, mostly on the north side of Minneapolis. We have a black hair and beauty care distributor cooperative, worker-owned cooperative that will hopefully be launched this year. The Ujamaa House, which is a Mothering Mothers, the Art of Mothering Institute.
For that one.
Yes. I got the most votes.
Yeah.
Word. All right.
Make is really amazing, and I'm really hoping. I can't wait for the doors of the Ujamaa House to open, because I think it's a really significant statement about what our community really values. And I've also been working on having some conversations with some nonprofit housing developers that are looking at ways of shifting their wealth and equity into the folks that they've been creating housing for many years. And so we're trying to figure out a model for those that might be interested into sharing cooperative ownership of the housing that they've bought over a number of years. And so that's a pretty exciting process. And I think one that if we can figure out something that works pretty smoothly, that a lot of other communities could maybe consider doing. As nonprofit housing developers, what this person has said to me is that there's no reason for me to have that equity or for our nonprofit to have that equity and to have that wealth. When our mission is saying that we want to do this for our community, then let's really figure out how to put that wealth really truly back in their hands. And also the North Side, that's a North Side strategy. And for those folks that aren't from Minneapolis, our housing and the cost of housing and properties just keep continuing to skyrocket. And the North Side has also begun to be really impacted by that, but it's kind of the last place in the city. And it's also where the most Black folks are, of course, right? And so it's really important that we figure out ways to pause a market that is really inhumane and doesn't pause for profit. And so we're trying to figure out all these different strategies for how we might do that. Emily, I was wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit about, because I think that you were the first one that really told me that with cooperative ecosystems, the ones that have started really well have always had a financial cooperative or a credit union.
Yeah, historically, anytime there was a cooperative community that was intentionally designed or unintentionally, when you go back and you look at the initial cooperatives that were established, the first two were always a financial cooperative and some kind of education. So whether it be a trade school, whether it be, cooperative education, whatever it is. So we're basically doing it. I don't know. So it's exciting to see the beginnings of that. I think that ties into your earlier question about what are the larger implications and the things that need to happen. And as Danielle talks about all these Black co-ops that are starting up and that are coming out and getting funding and moving forward, I really think that anchoring this and having an institution to be able to facilitate some of this work, because banks won't do it, because other credit unions are not mission driven. Having a mission-driven and community-owned and Black-led community financial cooperative is really important in all of this actually being able to work, because everybody hits the wall when it comes to the financing, and you can't find that financial partner just to do the transaction. Everyone can have all the money in the world, but if you can't find a vehicle by which to make those transactions legally, then there's a lot of issues. So it's really important that we have Village. It's really important that we have North Star. And it's really important that we have these kind of conversations to circulate these models. As we learn more and share more, we want to see what other communities start to do. We know there's vibrant cooperative spaces in Chicago, in Detroit, in St. Louis, in Mississippi, in Oakland, and the list goes on and on. So we're hoping that we'll start to hear back around what other folks are practicing and what they're learning, so that we can all kind of come up, in that same soil. So we'll see.
Absolutely. To one of Danielle's points just about the housing, I actually had someone invite me recently just because they had heard about the work that I was doing around cooperative conversations effectively. I mean, that's much of what I've been having, towards this idea of just making sure that people are familiar with models. But they had invited me to a Facebook group that was something around the lines of building owners for non-exploitative housing, non-exploitative affordable housing. Effectively, they're really trying to figure out how to be in a space where they do own property, but they don't want to have exploitative pricing, in areas that have skyrocketed. We've got sort of the inverse. It's our north side has always been high. Our south side, is the space that is now rapidly rising in price with, anchor institutions like the Obama Presidential Center. So, there's a lot that's happening there for us on that front. But, one of the things that I responded to the group with, just it's definitely a challenge to put forward to folks. Janelle Orsi of Sustainable Economies Law Center, was on a Next System podcast, and she was like, hey, look, I make a fair amount of money in sort of legal profession. It's not low, right? But I have to question whether or not ownership is proper, right? Whether or not my values are invested in owning a piece of property individually, and or whether you have to kind of think about, let me put my investment towards this social ownership model that survives me, that lives beyond me. And certainly we've seen that with the work of the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative, and what they're thinking through there in terms of certainly the Bay Area is one of those spaces that is also experiencing its own bit of rapid runaway house pricing. So we all have to think about, if we are owning property, what does that look like to then shift towards social ownership strategies? And I've actually talked to folks recently just about the fact that, I have a piece of property that of mine, it's just my personal home. But at some point, when I think about shifting away from that property, does that go into a land trust? Does that become the first sort of piece of property in a land trust? But it's a conversation we all internally have to figure out and think through. We did pull a question in that I want to offer a response for. So Mike Johnson says, have you encountered much resistance on the concept of local control of commerce? And if so, how do you overcome it? I talk about co-ops and people look at me like I'm crazy.
The concept of co-ops is really, it's difficult to present by itself. So I think without narrative and without context in the delivery model, especially something like a mission, it's difficult. And I said this in cooperative communities as well, is that when you start with the 7 cooperative principles, like people's eyes glaze over. And so you really need to start with, what does it mean to cooperate in the context of the people that you're talking to? In our community, it's like, I remember, my young days as a single mom and, sharing cars with other single moms or sharing babysitting time with other single moms and different ways that we do that, and helping folks to find that personal connection is really important. The other is that there's a broader mission here. So the cooperative entity is a vehicle for a larger outcome. And it's a vehicle because it fits our situation better than the capitalistic, structures. And so when we explain it in that way, it's like we're all trying to get to the promised land. It's just that this is a better vehicle and by which to get there, and this is why. And so when you shape it in context, it's a little bit easier. So think about who your audience is. What is the central theme that you're both working towards, whatever it is that's connecting you, and find the context and narrative to shape that with, a shared mission that you're trying to achieve, and use the cooperative as a vehicle, not necessarily the thing to focus on, but it's a mechanism by which we can do this in equitable and humane ways, that we can do business, that we can take back the commons. Don't say those words, but, that concept. People, you say take back the commons and people are like, what? So it's really important, especially in Black community where people don't know. They think co-op and they think the bougie grocery store, down in Uptown. But when you talk about who are you as a cooperator? Do you share? Do you prefer to be in communal spaces? Do you prefer to think about the whole as opposed to the individual? That means that you're a cooperator, and this is what this means that we can do together. So bringing that personal identification in it, tying in the mission that you're both interested in achieving, and using the cooperative is just a method. It's an infrastructure that we use in order to get there that's more effective, equitable, and humane. And that way it kind of helps to shape the conversation in ways that don't cause people to just ask a million questions or put up a defense because they don't quite understand what that is. We can get to that part later. Let's just agree that the general principles make sense and that we're both wanting to get to where we need to go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think to Malia's point about the grocery stores, so in the Twin Cities, we have all of these consumer cooperatives that are they can be more high priced, a lot of organic foods and things like that. And so to a lot of the Black community members, they're like, co-ops aren't for us, because that's what the most visible cooperative that we have in our community. And so when you start talking about co-ops, people are like, you're bougie. Like, we don't have nothing to do with you. Like, what are you talking about? And so I've used this cooperative gallery tool a lot, where we talk about, you know, what are the different cooperative initiatives through Black history and presently that you may not have thought of as a co-op. And so everyone's always like, oh my gosh, look at the Black Panthers. Like, look at everything that the Black Panthers did. And when you look at the list of initiatives that the Black Panthers had going on and how they got all those things going, everything from, you know, the launch of the breakfast programs to sickle cell anemia organizations, or support to community clinics, all these different types of things that were all cooperatively led and run. And so I think, again, that whole like reclaiming what it is that we're doing. And another reason why I wanted to create North Star was that a lot of the ways that the traditional financing system has been so extractive, only using credit scores, lending based upon your zip code, which they still do for small business loans and things like that. So with a cooperative model, a lot of the worker-owned cooperatives, housing cooperatives, if you're working with a cooperative lender or a bank that understands cooperatives, they'll use different things for collateral beyond your personal credit score. Oftentimes, they won't even pull your personal credit score. So for those of us, if that's a barrier, something that you feel a sense of shame about or something like that, this is a different path that you can walk on that can treat you more like a human from the beginning to the end, hopefully.
Excellent. Yes, that was very thoroughly covered, and we have a different type of situation. While we do now have two active food cooperatives and two forming. The one that is most well known on the south side is our Hyde Park Co-op, which managed to last I think about 90 years before it decided to expand to a second store and just flushed all its money down the drain. So the challenge there is that in its waning years, the people who were still around when it was here, when it was active, it didn't really function like a cooperative very much, right? There was very little sort of member engagement. There was very little push. It was just a grocery store that was around the corner that kind of sold a lot of high-priced food. So the unfortunate thing is that when people think of cooperatives on the south side, they're generally thinking of the Hyde Park Co-op. And, we now don't have a sort of active model that is really we do now have the Dill Pickle Co-op, and, the Dill Pickle is doing some of the elements of just trying to make sure that it's an accessible store model and really is kind of doing some of the outreach and taking up some of the cooperative space. But it's still very far away for people, who live on the south and west sides. It's, in Logan Square, which is a neighborhood way up north, and in Chicago, up north is a day trip. So, so it's definitely a challenge, but I am certainly in agreement with you about making sure that we are building accessible spaces. And to that point, I just want to let folks know about Cooperation for Liberation. We had our last session yesterday on 3/11. We'll have our next session on 3/24. Cooperation for Liberation is a space where we are building out space to make sure that we are able to have these conversations in the company of other people who are co-op curious. And so it's really a space where we can learn together, where we can grow together, and we look forward to the opportunity to take a few field trips to our friends around the Midwest, like Minneapolis, like Detroit, like why am I blanking? Cincinnati, whoever. We'll be traveling around the Midwest this season. Indianapolis, that's what I was trying to get at. Keperu Institute. So yes, we're going to be scooting around the Midwest, with the Cooperation for Liberation sometime in April. So if you have not been to a session, make sure you come join us for a session before we get to planning that trip, so you can be on board with that. And we are certainly very inspired by the models coming out of Nexus, coming out of North Star, coming out of Village Financial, coming out of Minneapolis, and we are going to keep these cooperative winds blowing. And yes, so with that, I do want to thank you all for your participation this evening. Really appreciate the conversation, the dialogue. We'll make sure that we continue telling everybody about the work that's happening there. And
yeah, your work too. Thank you so much for all the connecting and all the sharing of knowledge and information and making good work happen all the time. It's amazing.
It is.
No, much appreciated, much appreciated. And yes, and you all have a good evening.
You too.
You too. Good night.
All right. Good night. All right, everybody. That concludes this episode of the Ujamaa Hour. You see that my clock has run down to 0, so this is probably going to be a record-setting episode as the longest episode ever, but that's just because we want to make sure that we bring you thoroughly engaging, engrossing, full conversations around these cooperative strategies. We want you to have the tools that you need to go forward and build these spaces, use these strategies inside of your neighborhood, inside of your work, inside of your communities, and we will continue to have these conversations with Black cooperators all throughout the country. And make sure that we can build that work here at home in Chicago, as it were. So wherever you are, whenever you are, make sure that you are continuing to think through those principles, apply those principles, engage those principles, and we'll continue to bring you the best cooperative strategies we can locate. Until then, see you all next time. Second Monday of the month, not first, second Monday of the month, yes. We'll see you again on the second Monday. So we'll be back here on 4/11, April 11th, with another interview. Do I not have the name of the folk that I'm interviewing next month? In any case, make sure you check Biba. We'll be there with the interview that we'll have for that month. And yes, until then, peace.